Excited to see so many people from all across the globe joining us today. And then we're going to have Jody, Tony, and Wally kind of introduce the topic at hand. They're going to provide some of their comments and really like frame our discussion. And then in breakouts or potentially as a larger group, depending on how many people want to share innovations, we're going to have a chance for folks to kind of share different RC innovations or innovations RC today for 10 minutes. And then as a whole, we're going to kind of share back what we're talking about. So there's a little bit of flexibility in these second two parts, depending on how many people would like to share innovations. But for the most part, it's going to be a very discussion focused.
Yes, and really happy to see all these familiar faces and some new faces. And it seems like a time that relational coordination is really needed, particularly the shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect part of it in many domains of our lives. So I just wanted to say a few words about where the theory came from and how it began to shift from a theory of performance to a theory of change.
So just thinking about this conversation today, it was 14 years ago that I called you after we met on a conference call and said, has anybody been using this survey, the RC survey, in an interventional way? It's been a very powerful research tool, but I could see this being useful with teams to help them take a look at themselves, take a look in the mirror, and then start to reflect on how they're working together. It's so much more useful to just ask, how are you all working together? Which kind of goes over like with a thumb. It's not a very helpful question.
And to everyone on the call, I'm really looking forward to hearing about, how people are pushing the boundaries, with their use of RC. I usually say that my first introduction to RC was in 2017 when I took Jody's class, and it just resonated so much with a lot of things that I've been thinking about in my workplace, but also over the years I found RC to be very useful in my life in general, not just in the workplace. And so
I've been using it as a leadership development tool, where I've combined it with some other like theories of management, like the leadership pipeline and like sense making communication, and then and some sort of like look at what is the annual wheel of your structure going on, what is the strategy that you are right now trying to make into an action plan, and then use the relational coordination map, the mapping of relations, to ask them like where are they, and in a leadership pipeline, where are they at as managers, and what are they then supposed to delegate to others and not take care of themselves, and then how does the team then communicate with other teams and actually put like strategy into action.
You're basically interviewing, I mean, the survey data comes from personal interviews. So you're asking everybody in the community questions about themselves, their intentions, their identity, and so forth, and asking them what kind of relationships they have with other people in the community. And you can ask any question you want about whatever you think your theory of change is. It's important to be empathetic. It's important to have a certain capacity. It's important to develop a deep relationship with this person. You can ask those kinds of questions and have that visualized in the map.
For the common, for being able to take upon the common task that they all contribute to. And then they do in each of the function group, sometimes only without the leaders, but most recently, mostly with their leader together with the group. And they have this map with all the groups, and they do the mapping, and then they have the opportunity. And we emphasize they put green notes, sticky notes on the relationship that are helpful in them being able to take upon their task.
We, after being trained in RC, and Tony was a part of that as well, we started off kind of narrow. We wanted to change the relationships from professional advisors to faculty advisors, and in particular, a transitional point. So we did similar to what was just discussed. We were able to write a grant. The grant funded an advising council to get a little bit more trained. We did a wonderful, really great, we heard a lot of good things about a full day workshop that we did, which was both informational and playful, for lack of a better word. We had a lot of our goal was relational interventions, and we accomplished that.
Well, how can I create a shared language? How can I get people to see their own behavior and to understand other people's behavior and why people feel and act and think certain ways in different situations? And met my now business partner, who's a game designer, and thinking about games as a collaborative problem-solving opportunity. And there's all different types of games, all different types of activities. And people, when they're playing with their colleagues, they show up as themselves. And a lot of the elements of their personalities, a lot of the potential areas for tension or conflict, or potential areas for connection and increased engagement and motivation will come out. And they can form this shared language and this shared memory to start talking about that and start exploring, you know, what are our shared goals or shared values, or what are our process needs?
Well, I guess I was on the phone with Jody some 11 years ago, the first time, and we were discussing things. And from the first discussion we had, I was puzzled with those. And I'm an interventionist as well as a researcher, but you remember you were spending structural work for us and relational interventions. And I was studying different kind of organizations and found that when in the same structures and when different structures were implementing, some teams were excellent and some teams were really poor in RC. And so why was that if structural intervention works? So that led me to look into sort of the detail of when does it seem like structural interventions and when does it seem like relational interventions are more effective? And another thing I start looking at, who decide on which kind of intervention is used. And of course, then you have to look at the role of leaders. And seemingly, and at least in Scandinavian countries, it seems like relational interventions and to some extent work process interventions is something that's more a decision of frontline leaders. But when it comes to bigger structural intervention, that's more the role of senior leaders. And so what we learned so far is that it seemed like that structural interventions has the highest impact on RC in medium or low complex cases. But when we look at really high complex social service interventions, it seems like the effect of structural intervention is very low, but the relational interventions are very high.
We've been using RC in various ways since about 2015-16 here, and predominantly using it with frontline clinical teams to improve their efficiency and performance. I could talk a lot, but I'll just mention two things. One is kind of a complementary, innovative approach that we're using with RC, and that's to combine it with what we call translational simulation. And for clinical people, they'll be very familiar with the traditional use of simulation to hone clinical skills. We use a form of simulation which really explores the relational dynamics in the work process that we're looking at. So we found that a very useful complementary tool to use, both in the exploratory stage, but also when we're thinking about interventions as a way to introduce practice and embed new ways of working. It's been particularly useful in our high-end clinical areas in ED and obstetric emergencies.
So I don't think we're using it innovatively. So, you know, we're kind of very new to this and probably more using it against the rules. So having done the training that talks about, you know, keeping it small and keeping it to a work process, we've used it in two different ways, which one wasn't small, so it was across organisations, across our system. And we went from trying to look at a very small process or for a very select few, a group of young people, to where everybody that was a part of that process, even at arm's length, wanted to be a part of it. So because there was so much tension across the system between kind of your statutory services, your third sector and charity services, and people being left out, and that kind of thing. So we let it run, and I guess the learning from that was the results weren't, well, they were what they were. It wasn't life-changing. But what it allowed is those people across that system, across those different organisations that only communicated probably in a sort of negative or defensive way, to have different conversations. And actually it's allowed us now to, we're going to rerun it again, but on the small pathway with the select few. So sometimes it's not about, it's using it as a tool to get to a place. That was the one example. Then the other is probably around how we're using it with some of our senior managers and teams. So where you should use a work process, we've gone for an activity, which is leading the organisation, which feels different, but again, it's using it as an intervention to start those conversations, to get them to a point where they see themselves as one. So when you break them down into their smaller groups, and you can start looking about, between and, well, inward and then between each other, actually we come from a place of being connected to start with, not breaking them even further. So I suppose those are my examples. I don't know if they're helpful or not, but there you go.
So we are using it at that level, and it's part of our assessment. And we also use it as an assessment in our regional dissemination network to keep tabs on how are we doing over time with those relationships within our teams and between our teams. So it's a great, we'll be able to track it with our CEP population. We have a really robust set of data with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, with so many cystic fibrosis programs that have taken this evaluation over the years. That gives us some really good data to work with.